decreed. He couldn't remember how he got there. He woke up in a hospital, tubes connected to every part of him. He could hear the steady beep 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 his heart made on the monitor. He kept his eyes closed and listened for sound. The EKG told him he was in a hospital, so he sought out voices. English. People were speaking English in the hall outside of his door. America. His chest hurt, and he remembered being shot. A nurse bustled in and grabbed his chart. "We've been waiting for you to wake up," she said as she scribbled on the clipboard. He cracked open an eye and winced at the light through the window. He was in a double room, but the other bed was empty. He was right, tubes were everywhere, even his throat. He fought back a gag reflex. "Let me get that," she said and helped remove it. He coughed, and she held up a small glass of water with a straw. "Your throat is going to hurt for a while," she said. "You've been intubated for about 2 weeks." He tried to move his legs and arms, test the muscles. His left wrist was handcuffed to the bed. The nurse heard it jingle. "Yeah, the police want to talk to you. They have to with every gunshot victim we get. Do you remember what happened to you?" He shook his head. But he did. Veronica. Ron. Pulled a con to get him back to America and pulled a trigger in the desert outside of San Diego. He liked her too, which made the con even easier. Now he would have to find her and repay the favor. "I have to call San Diego PD. You just trust. They should be here in a couple of hours." She pushed the call button into his right hand. "Call if you need anything. The doctor will stop by on his rounds and when he clears you, we can get you some food." His stomach rumbled as if it hurt her. She smiled and patted his arm. He pointed at the water and motioned to his mouth. She leaned in, so he could sip down a whole cup again. While she was distracted, he lifted a pen from her pocket and nodded as she left. He couldn't hang around for cops. He wasn't wanted in the U.S., but they would ask a lot of questions. He didn't want to answer them. He began a series of tensing and releasing muscles, starting with his toes. It was something he had learned a long time ago, a meditative practice. He hadn't been in the States in over a decade, so he wouldn't have any contacts here. Getting around was going to be difficult. Still, it was what he was trained to do, just like the recovery meditation. He couldn't worry about it, just solve the problems as they happened. That was the simplest way to approach any obstacle, especially if the odds seemed overwhelming. Break it down into steps, solve the first step, move on. Once you solve enough steps, the obstacle is gone. He needed to get out of the hospital, figure out where he was, and find food and shelter. First problem, get out of bed. He dropped the call button and screwed the top off the pen. He picked the handcuff lock and slid his wrist free. Then he started pulling tubes, taking his time to make sure nothing was too vital or leaked too much as he slid them free. A few drops of blood from the vein, and painful drips of urine from the catheter. He pulled himself up in bed, fought the dizziness and reached out to turn off the alarm on the heart monitor. Brill rolled his legs out of bed and struggled to stand. It took a minute to remember how to balance as the pins and needles attacked. He stood rock still as his muscles cramped and screamed, and ignored the pain. He took a tentative step, then another, holding onto the edge of the bed with his hand. His chest ached from the bullet wound, and nausea washed over him. He breathed through his nose, out through his mouth and willed the pain away. He dragged the cart with him as he checked the small closet. There was a bag with his fake kit and no cash in it, but his clothes were gone. All he had was the hospital gown. Brill limped over to the door and peeked through. The hospital corridor wasn't very busy, and he couldn't discern a pattern with the nurses as they moved from the station to check-in rooms. There were 3 of them, plus the nurse who had checked on him. He waited until the station was empty and they were occupied with a patient and started out into the hall. The EKG card hauled him short. It was plugged into the wall. He held a breath and yanked the leads off his chest. If the alarm went off, the nurses could force him back into the bed, and restrain him until the cops showed up. The alarm didn't go off on his monitor, though a beeping began at the nurse's station. He rolled the machine back into his room with a shove. He didn't have time to waste. He ambled down the hall, one hand trailing along the wall till he hit a corner and turned into another corridor. He spied the stairway exit and hit the door. He went down one floor and glanced out into the hallway. He didn't know the layout, but he needed to find clothes and a way out before the nurses raised too much of an alarm. He needed a distraction. A fire alarm would do nicely, but he couldn't see one on the wall. No doubt he wasn't the first patient with a penchant for mayhem. He moved up the hallway, getting a little bit faster with each step. He was still weak, and his stomach cramped, reminding him he had lived on glucose for a few weeks. He needed food. He glanced into the first room he found. There was a man sleeping in the bed, hooked up to an EKG machine. just as he had been. Brill padded over to his bed. There was an emergency button on the wall for codes. Brill slammed his hand into them all, grabbed the leads off the man and hurried back into the hall. Alarms were beeping in the room and at the nurse's station. He watched a group of nurses and a doctor run down the hall and into the room. He limped down the corridor as fast as he could. There was a doctor's lounge sign down one hall. He bumped the door open slowly. It was empty. He grabbed a pair of scrub pants off the shelf and shimmied into them, and a scrub top. There were still no shoes and bare feet would attract attention, but he would deal with that later. He pawed through the lockers, stopping to yank on a couple of padlocks. One was partially closed and popped open. He tore through the locker and found a wallet. He lifted the cash and a credit card, and held the shoes up to the bottom of his feet. No luck. He put the lock back on the locker and clicked it closed. Brill still had to get out of the hospital and the nurses would have noticed him gone by now. He wasn't sure of the lockdown protocol, but the place was sure to have security and he didn't want to kill anyone in his escape if he could avoid it. He moved into the hallway and marched down to the stairwell on the opposite end of the building. Moving still hurt, but he was used to pain. He took the stairs slowly, gripping the rail for balance. He made it to the bottom and shoved open the fire door. The alarm let everyone know someone left by that door. By the time security investigated, all they found was an empty alleyway.